Hi, guys. Welcome to day 7 of the apocalypse. Apparently, based on my experience for the last hour and a half, we are now getting ready for the rise of the machines because I recorded this whole video and it was awesome, and my foster dog was in it. And then I went to edit it and there was no sound. And then I spent an hour and a half trying to figure out what was wrong with the microphone. And then it was the stupidest fix on the planet. Not that I was dumb, just like, I don't know. Ugh. Anyway, all right. Let's talk about genetically modified foods, and let's do it fast so I can get to bed. All right. First of all, let's talk about some abbreviations. So GMO actually refers to a genetically modified organism. So it's the actual living thing that has been genetically modified. GMF is a genetically modified food. So that would be the food coming from that organism. So you've got a whole plant, that's the corn plant, and then you've got the ear of corn that you eat, that's the genetically modified food. So the GMO is the whole corn plant, the GMF is just the ear of corn that you eat. If we were genetically modifying cows, then the steak would be the GMF, it would be the genetically modified food. Here's the thing I want to make sure you guys understand though. Literally everything you eat is a genetically modified food. Unless you're eating inorganic things, in which case I'm a little worried about what you're eating, but anything that you're eating that ever was alive is a genetically modified food. And so here's an example of various things before we genetically modified them. So we modified their genes through the act of artificial selection. So there's what watermelon used to look like, corn, doesn't that look delicious? Eggplants, nothing at all like what they used to look or what they look like now. Bananas, ew, carrots, gross. Cabbage, kale, broccoli all came from that ancestor. So humans have done artificial selection, and we have modified the genes by having this organism and this organism mate so that then we can get this other organism. We are modifying genes all the time. The reason pugs exist is because of genetic modification. We have had different animals breed with each other to give us what we want. So if you had a non-genetically modified dog, you'd be walking around with a wolf, except not, because even that was genetically modified from something before. So everything that is out there is genetically modified right now. So there is, in fact, a better term for it, which is genetic engineering. So genetic engineering is what people talk about really when they say GMO. They don't really mean GMO, they mean GEO. They mean something that's been genetically engineered, okay? Because anytime somebody says, I don't like things that are genetically modified, then you don't like you, because you as a human are genetically modified. Your genes are very different from your ancestors' genes. So we have to just kind of keep in perspective what all of this really means. All right, so how do you genetically engineer an organism? How do you go about it? It sounds super complicated, sounds really crazy. It's actually really simple. So kind of like viruses were really simple but wreak a lot of havoc. Genetic engineering is really simple but super powerful. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take a useful gene out of one organism. So let's say I, as a human being, am able to produce insulin appropriately. And so my body can create insulin. So I have a gene in my cells that tells my cells how to make insulin. It's all the A's, G's, C's, and T's that are going to match up to the mRNA that's going to match up to give me the amino acid sequence that's going to build insulin, okay? So we're going to go into this human DNA sequence. We're going to find where the gene for insulin is. We're going to go in with some little scissors, and we're not going to use teeny tiny little cellular scissors. We're actually going to use enzymes. So there are enzymes that work as scissors, and we're going to snip out that gene. So those other parts of the DNA are going to go basically in the trash. We're going to get rid of them. And then the DNA that we want, that code that we want, we're actually going to embed that in a virus. So I love this because we're taking viruses that normally are really harmful and we're harnessing them and we're making them helpful for us. So we're going to put them inside of a virus. And then we're going to go to the organism we want to have growing and producing the insulin for us. So in this case, we're going to take a bacterium. So we're going to use our bacterial DNA. Now, hopefully you're looking at this and you're like, that's not what bacterial DNA looks like. Because of course you know that bacterial DNA is a circle, okay? But I've drawn it like this just for simplicity's sake. All right, so we're going to go in. We're going to use another enzyme to snip. It's going to snip a little spot in there so that we have a hole. So we have a space, and then what we're going to do is we're going to bring the virus in. We're going to let the virus infect our bacterium. The virus is going to leave and be done, and now we're going to have a bacterium that has that little chunk of DNA inside of it, And as far as the bacteria is concerned, that DNA is just part of its own DNA, and it's going to produce insulin for us. Now, we can do this with lots of different things. Let's say that there were roses that were especially red, and we found the gene that made them so red, and we put that into an apple, and we could make an apple that like would make Snow White just salivate. We could do that and have that one rose gene go into the apple, and now the apple is super bright red to this beautiful color that we really want it to be. So we can do lots of different things that we'll talk about in a minute, and then we're just going to let that organism grow. So in this case, the gene gets transcribed into the mRNA. That mRNA gets translated into the protein, the insulin, and now we've got all of the insulin being made, and we don't have to use all of the pigs and the pig pancreases that we used to have to use back in the day. Okay, so it's that simple. Okay, so what's really different? Well, the organism now produces one protein that it didn't used to produce. That's it, one. If we're getting really jazzy, maybe two or three, but really we're talking about one protein that it wasn't producing before, and now it's producing that protein. The difference is that that protein does some desired job that we wanted it to do. So maybe it's making the color of our hypothetical apple really red. Maybe we can take one of my genes and put it into the gene of another person who isn't making their own insulin, and then they can start to make their own insulin. All kinds of different things. So one thing we can do is we can make rice that provides vitamin A for people who don't have enough and might otherwise go blind. So just a couple months ago, the Philippines actually approved golden rice so that it can get used out in the world, so that people who are poor and don't have, not necessarily poor, so that people who have nutritional deficiencies who are eating rice but don't get enough vitamin A in the rest of their diet now can get the vitamin A through the rice that they're eating, and then don't go blind, which is pretty sweet, not being blind. We can make it so that plants actually don't have to be sprayed with pesticides. So this is one of the really common misconceptions about GMO foods, is that we think that we're just dumping all kinds of chemicals on them all the time. Well, in fact, if we genetically modify a plant, we can actually genetically modify it to create a protein that makes it so then the insects can't reproduce. And so they eat the plant once, but then they can't reproduce and make babies. And so that's going to kill off the population of the insects. And so we actually don't have to spray pesticides on the plants because the plants can do it themselves. They're not producing pesticides that are going to do anything to us. They're producing proteins that are going to affect only the insects. On the flip side, you may have heard of Roundup Ready plants. And Roundup Ready plants are plants that are resistant to weed killer. So if you've ever sprayed weed killer in your yard, you have to make sure you're careful about where you spray it, because you want to spray it on only the weeds and not the things that you actually want to keep. Because if you spray it on the things that you actually want to keep, they'll die too. But with Roundup Ready plants, which is just one brand of these different seeds, the farmers can spray the weed killer all over, so they can basically crop dust the weed killer all over, and the weed killer doesn't do anything to the plants themselves. It only kills off the weeds that are around. So yes, you're now going to have Roundup on your plants, but a couple caveats. One, despite what you may have heard in the media, no science has shown that Roundup is toxic to humans at any kind of reasonable dose. In order to get a lethal dose, or not even a lethal dose, a dose that would affect you from Roundup, you would have to eat something like 83 bowls of Cheerios in a day. I can't remember. I read it at one point, but it was some absurd amount where you're eating 83 bowls of Cheerios every day. So yeah, anything is a poison. I've told you that before. We know that water is a poison at high enough quantities. Roundup has not shown in any remotely reasonable quantity to be toxic to humans. The other thing is that actually cultivating by hand, so going in and weeding by hand, is more time consuming and more disruptive to the soil than using Roundup is, than using any of these chemical weed killers that we would put down. So there actually are some benefits to it, despite what you may have heard. All right, so we can also make the plants resistant to viruses. So this papaya ring spot virus was really threatening papayas in Hawaii, which is, it was threatening more than 50% of their papaya crop when that was their second most important fruit crop. And so once we can get these GMO papayas in there that are resistant to that rinse spot virus, that really helped Hawaii's economy. This is really cool. Imagine if instead of getting vaccines, instead of going in and having the nurse be like, pow, 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 with all those vaccines, they could be like, here, eat this banana. And you eat the banana and you're like, oh my God, that's way better than getting a shot. But not just like to get away from the unpleasantness of getting a shot, but in a lot of third world countries, there aren't enough supplies, there aren't clean syringes, we can't get the viral serums out there, we don't have medical personnel who can get out to the villages, we have people who are terrified of doctors, and we have people who are terrified of needles and shots and don't understand science and don't know why they should be letting somebody poke them with a needle. If instead they were able to grow these crops that then, you know, hey, go over to the vaccine banana farm and eat your banana for the day. We could take care of these things, and these countries could be more self-sustaining and take care of things in a much more economical way. Now, right now, it's not very economical because the companies are still developing the research. Interestingly enough, the most researched vegetable to put vaccines in was a potato. Which is really kind of impractical because once you cook a potato, you denature a bunch of proteins. So they're starting to look at other things like carrots and tomatoes and bananas and things like that. So they're looking for an ability to do that. They can also do antibodies. So we talked about passive immunity and getting antibodies. And so they found with some people who had Ebola, there were antibodies that helped them out. And so if you could get a plant to produce those Ebola antibodies, somebody gets Ebola and then you're like, hey, I'm going to need you to eat a really big salad. And then, you know, whatever it is in there, and then they can get well from Ebola. So really cool possibilities with this. We can also help crops grow in places they normally couldn't grow. So there are drought-resistant GMOs, there are frost-resistant GMOs. So we can grow things in places that are really arid, don't get enough water. We can grow things in places that are really cold. Maybe we really like tropical fruits and we want them to grow in a more temperate environment. Again, this is really important to people who cannot grow their own food. In the US, it's not as big of a deal because we have lots of farmers growing lots of food for us. But in other countries, there are people who can't grow food. They're trying and trying and trying, but their environment just isn't hospitable to growing the crops that they need to grow in order to have balanced nutrition. And so this can really help bring balanced nutrition to places that aren't self-sustaining. They can also help produce higher yields of crops. Now, sometimes people will say GMOs don't necessarily produce any higher yields. Part of the problem with that is that we haven't created crops with the intent of them producing higher yields. So we haven't gone in and modified proteins that will give higher yields. We've gone in and modified proteins to do other things, to create vaccines or to embed vaccines, I guess, or to make them resistant to pesticides or pests or, you know, things like that. The only genetically modified crop that was designed for a higher yield and is now sort of out there and approved is eucalyptus, developed in Brazil. And it was actually great because it produced 20% more wood and reduced the time of maturity from 7 years to 5.5 years. And so that's going to be really great for that industry. And then we can generally make food more attractive and delicious. So we've all had those apples that we want to put in our lunch and we're like, oh my God, it's going to be so brown by the time I get to lunch. But there are these apples called Arctic apples that don't turn brown. So you don't have to use all your tricks of like, oh, I just swish it around with a little lemon juice, or I just, you know, really make sure that all the air is sucked out, or I just eat a brown apple. Whatever it is, there are apples that are now going to not turn brown. All right, so what's everybody afraid of? Well, the biggest thing people are afraid of is the unknown. They don't understand the science. They don't understand that what we're really talking about is one gene, one protein, that's it. Everything else is the same. There are also some pretty skeevy business practices out there. So you've probably heard about Monsanto, and DuPont is another one, and they have some rules. And one of the rules that they have is that when they sell seeds to farmers, the farmers are not allowed to save seeds. So first of all, some people say, hey, if you're creating genetically modified foods, you shouldn't be selling them. You should be just giving them away out of the kindness of your heart. Well, this is kind of like that argument about vaccines. Like, well, no, you get to have a business too. But What Monsanto does is when people buy seeds, they have to sign a contract that says, I won't save seeds from year to year. And that's not referring to the seeds they've bought. That's referring to seeds that come out of whatever it is they're growing. So if I go buy a bunch of corn seeds and I plant my corn and now my corn grows, I'm not allowed to take my corn that grew, take the seeds from that corn and stash them off for next year and use that to plant my next year's crop. I have to go buy seeds again from Monsanto next year, which sounds really horrible and awful, except and it is true. Monsanto has totally sued, like, I don't know, 150 different farmers for saving seeds. But most of the time, farmers don't want to save seeds anyway. Part of that is because there's going to be new technology. Part of that is because even if they're not buying GMO seeds, they're probably buying hybrid seeds. And you should remember that hybrids are typically sterile. So when you've got a hybrid, it's not going to be able to produce fertile offspring. So it does you no good whatsoever to save the seeds of hybrids. So that's a pretty consistent practice. It's also, they've, to be fair, invested a ton of money into research and developing these, and they're going to recoup those costs. Now, whether they're recouping the costs at too high of a rate for it to be reasonable, again, skeevy business practices are a different thing. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't say, I'm going to have no GMOs at all on the entire planet because I don't like the way Monsanto does business. You can get rid of the way Monsanto does business and still keep genetically modified organisms or genetically engineered organisms to work for everyone else. Allergies. So some people are really freaked out and they swear that GMOs are higher in allergens. Well, they're not. Okay. Again, research has been done. They are not genetically modified organisms. Genetically engineered organisms are not any higher in allergens than any conventional food. So you don't need to work through this whole graphic. If you want to, you can. But here's the takeaway. The only way something is a problem is if that allergen is the targeted protein that we're moving back and forth. So let's say that there were something really good about a peanut that we wanted to put in a tangerine. I don't know what that would be, but there's this really good quality in a peanut that we want to put in a tangerine. And so we go into the peanut and we splice out that gene and put it in the tangerine. Okay, so we take that gene, put it in the tangerine now makes that protein. The only way that tangerine is a threat to someone with a peanut allergy is if that gene is creating the protein that is also the allergen. So if that protein is the allergen and also does the desired job, then we're in trouble. But as long as that protein is just doing the desired job and is not the one that was the allergen, then we have no problem whatsoever. And people with peanut allergies can go to town with those tangerines. And so what they do is when they do this, they go in and they test over and over again to make sure that the protein that is the desired trait is not also the allergen protein. And so they make sure that that's not going to happen. Cross-pollination with organic and native populations. So this is always a problem, again, no matter where you are. There are farms that are next to each other, and so you might have an organic farmer, and then you might have a conventional farmer who's growing GMOs, and that organic farmer is really unhappy because the GMO seeds are going to, and pollen are going to blow across the street and are going to blow over into their crops. The GMO seeds may also blow into native populations. So if they're next door to a forest preserve or something like that, again, those seeds might go. And that's just, I mean, it's going to happen. And so the people who are organic get really upset because they have to have very strict regulations in order to be able to slap an organic label on their food. So I don't really know what to say about that. Nature has been cross-pollinating for millions and millions of years. Another problem that organic farmers have is that it might actually increase pesticide resistance in insects, which makes it so that organic farmers can't use the pesticides they're used to using, or they have to use more. So let me debunk another myth here. Organic farmers do use pesticides. They just are very particular about which pesticides they will use. But organic food does use pesticides. They just pick out which ones they use. The problem, though, is if you've got something going on with this GMO population over here, that may affect the population of the insects that are in the area. And now those insects might be like, hey, if we go across the street, this one is going to be super cool and awesome, and we can gobble this one up. And the organic farmers are like, yo, we don't like that. Um, uh, there may be effects on the food web. So you may have actually just gone there in your head, where again, if I've now got these crops that are going to kill off all the mosquitoes, all the bugs that are going to come eat them, whatever the predator bug is, now I've knocked out that level in the food chain. I've taken out those insects. Well, now I might be taking out the birds that feed on those insects, and then I might be taking off some other predator that feeds on those birds. And so there might be a trickle down effect, kind of like there was in that Borneo. So we really have to be careful and make sure we're studying things to see what the impact is on the food web. And then there are some effects on the soil. So sometimes there's a loss of acidity with GMO foods. Sometimes, though, there are good effects. So, like I said before, when we're hand tilling, a lot of problems come up with going and digging up stuff by hand, and we can have an effect there as well. So there's kind of a balance there where there may be some chemical runoff. So if we're dumping Roundup all over our plants, there may be chemical runoff that's then going to go into the water. So we just have to be really careful about how we're maintaining our environment. But again, that's going to be the case with everything that we're growing and all of the fertilizers we're using and all of the various farming changes and evolutions that we have happening out there in the world. All right, so the question about labeling. Should we label or should we not label? Well, reasons that people say, hey, here's why you got to label. There are two big ones. They say people got to know what they're buying and they got to be able to decide whether or not they want to buy the product. You should know. Everybody should be informed. Everybody should know what's going on. So you got to let people know. Okay. So why would we not label? Well, one is it's going to cost a lot to redesign all the packaging. So if we go to every company that makes everything and we say you have to label if it does or does not have genetically modified or genetically engineered components, everybody's got to redesign their packaging. Prices are going to go up. Okay. Another reason is that people are going to avoid the foods out of unjustified fear. And let me be really, really clear here. Tons of research has been done. Longitudinal studies have been done. You are a walking longitudinal study because for more than 20 years, genetically engineered foods have been just food. And we've all been eating genetically engineered foods and we are all fine. There are zero health problems that are connected to genetically engineered foods. So there is nothing that will impact your health from a genetically engineered food. In fact, there could be things that will be able to impact your health positively. For example, we could make peanuts that don't have the allergens that trigger people's allergies. We could make wheat that doesn't have gluten so that people who have gluten insensitivities can go back to eating bread that's been made with wheat. So we can do some really good things with genetic engineering. But right now, genetic engineering is not doing anything harmful to anyone's health. And then we're going to decrease research that could potentially save lives. So here's the deal. It is a luxury, in my opinion, to be able to choose whether I want to eat genetically engineered food or not eat genetically engineered food. Because ultimately, I'm going to get food. I have food. But there are people in lots of countries who do not have food. They don't care if it's genetically engineered or not genetically engineered. They just want food. Or they want rice that's going to help their children to not go blind. Or they want bananas that are going to help their children get vaccines, because that is significantly more important than, ew, it skeeves me out that somebody moved a gene from one place to another place. That's really irrelevant. So if we're talking about me saying, ew, it's gross versus somebody else's child living, I see that as privilege. So let's talk a little bit about labeling, because there was a really big push for a long time to say companies who use genetic engineering must label that they're using genetic engineering. So they said, if you use genetic engineering, we want you to label it. And that didn't fly. Manufacturers didn't let that happen. And so there was sort of a flip side, and there was the design of that little butterfly, the non-GMO project butterfly, saying, hey, this thing you're buying is non-GMO. And so they've decided they've redesigned their packaging as a selling point. Hey, buy me, I'm non-GMO. Okay. And typically the non-GMO things with that little label are going to cost you more because you're paying for that label. Here's another one, vitamins. Non-genetically engineered vitamins. I don't know. My vitamin pills don't tend to have DNA in them. I like this one too, clumping cat litter. Now, in this one's defense, it is made from grass. So I guess what they're saying is that the grass is non-GMO grass. I personally, however, do not care if what my cat is peeing and pooping on is genetically engineered or not genetically engineered. So, I mean, I guess that's just a judgment call. And then this one, which you're like, wait, Gnant, what? That's Triscuits. Like, we eat that. Yeah, definitely. Like, that comes from wheat, right? It says 100% whole grain wheat. Here's the deal, there's no genetically engineered wheat out there. So they can say, oh my God, our wheat is not genetically engineered. Yeah, so is the rest of the wheat that's out there that any of us are eating. In fact, there are only 10 commercially available GMO products in the US right now. So the only things that could possibly be genetically engineered on your shopping list are alfalfa, which you're probably not buying a lot of, although I don't know, apples, canola, so like your canola oil, corn, cotton, papayas, potatoes, soybeans, which admittedly there's a lot of soy in a lot of stuff, squash, sugar beets. This is it. This is what we've got that is GMO. So all of those other things that have that non-GMO label on them, when you go buy your grapes and your grapes are non-GMO, and you go buy your tomatoes and they're labeled non-GMO, like that label is unnecessary because that GMO version does not exist. So just be really thoughtful, be really smart and educated about what you're passing along and what you're reading and what you're believing, and make sure that when it comes to something like this, that you're keeping it all in perspective in terms of real science and what it really means, that we are really just taking one chunk of DNA and moving it over so that now that organism can produce one new protein. So unless you're really weirded out by whatever that one protein is, you probably shouldn't be weirded out by genetically engineered organisms. All right, that's all I got for you. Enjoy. I'm going to go to bed.